Mr. Know-all. A short story by Somerset Maugham. I was prepared to dislike Max Kelada even before I knew him. The war had just finished, and the passenger traffic in the ocean-going liners was heavy. Accommodation was very hard to get, and you had to put up with whatever the agents chose to offer you. You could not hope for a cabin to yourself, and I was thankful to be given one in which there were only 2 berths. But when I was told the name of my companion, my heart sank. It suggested closed portholes and the night air rigidly excluded. It was bad enough to share a cabin for 14 days with anyone. I was going from San Francisco to Yokohama. But I should have looked upon it with less dismay if my fellow passenger's name had been Smith or Brown. When I went on board, I found Mr. Kelada's luggage already below. I did not like the look of it. There were too many labels on the suitcases, and the wardrobe trunk was too big. He had unpacked his toilet things, and I observed that he was a patron of the excellent Monsieur Coty, for I saw on the washing stand his scent, his hair wash, and his brilliantine. Mr. Kelada's brushes, ebony with his monogram in gold, would have been all the better for a scrub. I did not at all like Mr. Kelada. I made my way into the smoking room. I called for a pack of cards and began to play patience. I had scarcely started before a man came up to me and asked me if he was right in thinking my name was so-and-so. "I am Mr. Kelada," he added, with a smile that showed a row of flashing teeth, and sat down. "Oh yes, we're sharing a cabin, I think. Bit of luck, I call it. You never know who you're going to be put in with. I was jolly glad when I heard you were English. I'm all for us English sticking together when we're abroad, if you understand what I mean." I blinked. "Are you English?" I asked, perhaps tactlessly. "Rather. You don't think I look like an American, do you? British to the backbone, that's what I am." To prove it, Mr. Kelada took out of his pocket a passport and airily waved it under my nose. King George has many strange subjects. Mr. Kelada was short and of a sturdy build, clean-shaven and dark-skinned, with a fleshy, hooked nose and very large, lustrous and liquid eyes. His long black hair was sleek and curly. He spoke with a fluency in which there was nothing English, and his gestures were exuberant. I felt pretty sure that a closer inspection of that British passport would have betrayed the fact that Mr. Kelada was born under a bluer sky than is generally seen in England. "What will you have?" he asked me. I looked at him doubtfully. Prohibition was in force, and to all appearances the ship was bone dry. When I'm not thirsty, I do not know which I dislike more, ginger ale or lemon squash. But Mr. Kelada flashed an oriental smile at me. "Whiskey and soda or a dry martini, you have only to say the word." From each of his hip pockets he fished a flask and laid them on the table before me. I chose the martini, and calling the steward, he ordered a tumbler of ice and a couple of glasses. "A very good cocktail," I said. "Well, there are plenty more where that came from, and if you've got any friends on board, you tell them you've got a pal who's got all the liquor in the world." Mr. Kelada was chatty. He talked of New York and of San Francisco. He discussed plays, pictures, and politics. He was patriotic. The Union Jack is an impressive piece of drapery, but when it is flourished by a gentleman from Alexandria or Beirut, I cannot but feel that it loses somewhat in dignity. Mr. Kelada was familiar. I do not wish to put on airs, but I cannot help feeling that it is seemly in a total stranger to put Mr. before my name when he addresses me. Mr. Kelada, doubtless to set me at my ease, used no such formality. I did not like Mr. Kelada. I had put aside the cards when he sat down, but now, thinking that for this first occasion our conversation had lasted long enough, I went on with my game. "The 3 on the 4, said Mr. Kelada. "There is nothing more exasperating when you are playing patience than to be told where to put the card you have turned up before you have had a chance to look for yourself. It's coming out, he cried. "The 10 on the knave." With rage and hatred in my heart, I finished. Then he seized the pack. "Do you like card tricks?" "No, I hate card tricks," I answered. "Well, I'll just show you this one." He showed me 3. Then I said I would go down to the dining room and get my seat at table. "Oh, that's all right," he said. "I've already taken a seat for you." I thought that as we were in the same stateroom, we might just as well sit at the same table. I did not like Mr. Kelada. I not only shared a cabin with him and ate 3 meals a day at the same table, but I could not walk round the deck without his joining me. It was impossible to snub him. It never occurred to him that he was not wanted. He was certain that you were as glad to see him as he was to see you. In your own house, you might have kicked him downstairs and slammed the door in his face, without the suspicion dawning on him that he was not a welcome visitor. He was a good mixer, and in 3 days knew everyone on board. He ran everything. He managed the sweeps, conducted the auctions, collected money for prizes at the sports, got up quoit and golf matches, organized the concert, and arranged the fancy dress ball. He was everywhere and always. He was certainly the best-hated man in the ship. We called him Mr. Know-All, even to his face. He took it as a compliment, but it was at meal times that he was most intolerable. For the better part of an hour, then, he had us at his mercy. He was hearty, jovial, loquacious, and argumentative. He knew everything better than anybody else, and it was an affront to his overweening vanity that you should disagree with him. He would not drop a subject, however unimportant, till he had brought you round to his way of thinking. The possibility that he could be mistaken never occurred to him. He was the chap who knew. We sat at the doctor's table. Mr. Kelada would certainly have had it all his own way, for the doctor was lazy and I was frigidly indifferent, except for a man called Ramsay who sat there also. He was as dogmatic as Mr. Kelada and resented bitterly the Levantines' cocksureness. The discussions they had were acrimonious and interminable. Ramsay was in the American consular service and was stationed at Kobe. He was a great heavy fellow from the Middle West, with loose fat under a tight skin, and he bulged out of his ready-made clothes. He was on his way back to resume his post, having been on a flying visit to New York to fetch his wife, who had been spending a year at home. Mrs. Ramsay was a very pretty little thing, with pleasant manners and a sense of humor. The consular service is ill-paid, and she was dressed always very simply, but she knew how to wear her clothes. She achieved an effect of quiet distinction. I should not have paid any particular attention to her, but that she possessed a quality that may be common enough in women, but nowadays is not obvious in their demeanor. You could not look at her without being struck by her modesty. It shone in her like a flower on a coat. One evening at dinner, the conversation by chance drifted to the subject of pearls. There had been in the papers a good deal of talk about the culture pearls which the cunning Japanese were making, and the doctor remarked that they must inevitably diminish the value of real ones. They were very good already, they would soon be perfect. Mr. Kelada, as was his habit, rushed the new topic. He told us all that was to be known about pearls. I do not believe Ramsay knew anything about them at all, but he could not resist the opportunity to have a fling at the Levantine, and in 5 minutes we were in the middle of a heated argument. I had seen Mr. Kelada vehement and voluble before, but never so voluble and vehement as now. At last, something that Ramsay said stung him, for he thumped the table and shouted, "Well, I ought to know what I am talking about. I'm going to Japan just to look into this Japanese pearl business. I'm in the trade, and there's not a man in it who won't tell you that what I say about pearls goes. I know all the best pearls in the world, and what I don't know about pearls isn't worth knowing." Here was news for us, for Mr. Kelada, with all his loquacity, had never told anyone what his business was. We only knew vaguely that he was going to Japan on some commercial errand. He looked round the table triumphantly. They'll never be able to get a culture pearl that an expert like me can't tell with half an eye." He pointed to a chain that Mrs. Ramsay wore. "You take my word for it, Mrs. Ramsay. That chain you're wearing will never be worth a cent less than it is now." Mrs. Ramsay, in her modest way, flushed a little and slipped the chain inside her dress. Ramsay leaned forward. He gave us all a look, and a smile flickered in his eyes. "That's a pretty chain of Mrs. Ramsay's, isn't it?" "I noticed it at once," answered Mr. Kelada. "Gee," I said to myself, "those are pearls, all right." I didn't buy it myself, of course. I'd be interested to know how much you think it cost. "Oh, in the trade, somewhere around $15,000. But if it was bought on Fifth Avenue, I shouldn't be surprised to hear that anything up to $30,000 was paid for it." Ramsay smiled grimly. "You'll be surprised to hear that Mrs. Ramsay bought that string at a department store the day before we left New York, for $18. Mr. Kelada flushed. "Rot. It's not only real, but it's as fine a string for its size as I've ever seen." "Will you bet on it?" "I'll bet you $100 it's imitation." "Done." "Oh, Elmer, you can't bet on a certainty," said Mrs. Ramsay. She had a little smile on her lips, and her tone was gently deprecating. "Can't I? If I get a chance of easy money like that, I should be all sorts of a fool not to take it." "But how can it be proved?" she continued. "It's only my word against Mr. Kelada's." "Let me look at the chain, and if it's imitation, I'll tell you quickly enough. I can afford to lose $100, said Mr. Kelada. "Take it off, dear. Let the gentleman look at it as much as he wants." Mrs. Ramsay hesitated a moment. She put her hands to the clasp. "I can't undo it," she said. "Mr. Kelada will just have to take my word for it." I had a sudden suspicion that something unfortunate was about to occur, but I could think of nothing to say. Ramsay jumped up. "I'll undo it." He handed the chain to Mr. Kelada. The Levantine took a magnifying glass from his pocket and closely examined it. A smile of triumph spread over his smooth and swarthy face. He handed back the chain. He was about to speak. Suddenly he caught sight of Mrs. Ramsay's face. It was so white that she looked as though she were about to faint. She was staring at him with wide and terrified eyes. They held a desperate appeal. It was so clear that I wondered why her husband did not see it. Mr. Kelada stopped with his mouth open. He flushed deeply. You could almost see the effort he was making over himself. "I was mistaken," he said. "It's a very good imitation, but of course, as soon as I looked through my glass, I saw that it wasn't real. I think $18 is just about as much as the damn thing's worth." He took out his pocketbook, and from it, a $100 note. He handed it to Ramsay without a word. "Perhaps that'll teach you not to be so cocksure another time, my young friend," said Ramsay as he took the note. I noticed that Mr. Kelada's hands were trembling. The story spread over the ship as stories do, and he had to put up with a good deal of chaff that evening. It was a fine joke that Mr. Know-All had been caught out. But Mrs. Ramsay retired to her stateroom with a headache. Next morning I got up and began to shave. Mr. Kelada lay on his bed smoking a cigarette. Suddenly there was a small scraping sound, and I saw a letter pushed under the door. I opened the door and looked out. There was nobody there. I picked up the letter and saw that it was addressed to Max Kelada. The name was written in block letters. I handed it to him. "Who's this from?" He opened it. "Oh!" He took out of the envelope not a letter, but a $100 note. He looked at me, and again he reddened. He tore the envelope into little bits and gave them to me. "Do you mind just throwing them out of the porthole?" I did as he asked, and then I looked at him with a smile. "No one likes being made to look a perfect damned fool," he said. "Were the pearls real?" "If I had a pretty little wife, I shouldn't let her spend a year in New York while I stayed at Kobe," said he. At that moment I did not entirely dislike Mr. Kelada. He reached out for his pocketbook and carefully put in it the $100 note. The Promise, a short story by Somerset Maugham. My wife is a very unpunctual woman, so when having arranged to lunch with her at Claridge's, I arrived there 10 minutes late and did not find her. I was not surprised. I ordered a cocktail. It was the height of the season, and there were but 2 or 3 vacant tables in the lounge. Some of the people, after an early meal, were drinking their coffee. Others, like myself, were toying with a dry martini. The women in their summer frocks looked gay and charming, and the men debonair. But I could see no one whose appearance sufficiently interested me to occupy the quarter of an hour I was expecting to wait. They were slim and pleasant to look upon, well-dressed and carelessly at ease. But they were, for the most part, of a pattern, and I observed them with tolerance rather than with curiosity. But it was 2 o'clock, and I felt hungry. My wife tells me that she can neither wear a turquoise nor a watch, for the turquoise turns green and the watch stops. And this she attributes to the malignity of fate. I have nothing to say about the turquoise, but I sometimes think the watch might go if she wound it. I was engaged with these reflections when an attendant came up, and with that hushed significance that hotel attendants affect, as though their message held a more sinister meaning than their words suggested, told me that a lady had just telephoned to say that she had been detained and could not lunch with me. I hesitated. It is not very amusing to eat in a crowded restaurant by oneself, but it was late to go to a club, and I decided that I had better stay where I was. I strolled into the dining room. It has never given me any particular satisfaction, as it appears to do to so many elegant persons, to be known by name to the head waiters of fashionable restaurants, but on this occasion I should certainly have been glad to be greeted by less stony an eye. The maître d'hôtel, with a set and hostile face, told me that every table was occupied. I looked helplessly round the large and stately room, and on a sudden, to my pleasure, caught sight of someone I knew. Lady Elizabeth Vermont was an old friend. She smiled, and noticing that she was alone, I went up to her. "Will you take pity on a hungry man and let me sit with you?" I asked. "Oh, do, but I've nearly finished." She was at a little table by the side of a massive column, and when I took my place I found that, notwithstanding the crowd, we sat almost in privacy. "This is a bit of luck for me," I said. I was on the point of fainting from hunger. She had a very agreeable smile. It did not light up her face suddenly, but seemed rather to suffuse it by degrees with charm. It hesitated for a moment about her lips, and then slowly travelled to those great, shining eyes of hers, and there softly lingered. No one surely could say that Elizabeth Vermont was cast in the common mould. I never knew her when she was a girl, but many have told me that then she was so lovely it brought the tears to one's eyes, and I could well believe it. For now, though 50, she was still incomparable. Her ravaged beauty made the fresh and blooming comeliness of youth a trifle insipid. I do not like these painted faces that look all alike, and I think women are foolish to dull their expression and obscure their personality with powder, rouge, and lipstick. But Elizabeth Vermont painted not to imitate nature, but to improve it. You did not question the means, but applauded the result. The flaunting boldness with which she used cosmetics increased rather than diminished the character of that perfect face. I suppose her hair was dyed. It was black and sleek and shining. She held herself upright as though she had never learned to loll, and she was very slim. She wore a dress of black satin, the lines and simplicity of which were admirable, and about her neck was a long rope of pearls. Her only other jewel was an enormous emerald which guarded her wedding ring, and its sombre fire emphasized the whiteness of her hand. But it was in her hands, with their reddened nails, that she most clearly betrayed her age. They had none of a girl's soft and dimpled roundness, and you could not but look at them with a certain dismay. Before very long, they would look like the talons of a bird of prey. Elizabeth Vermont was a remarkable woman. Of great birth, for she was the daughter of the 7th Duke of St. Erth, she married at the age of 18 a very rich man, and started at once upon a career of astounding extravagance, lewdness, and dissipation. She was too proud to be cautious, too reckless to think of consequences, and within 2 years her husband, in circumstances of appalling scandal, divorced her. She married then one of the 3 co-respondents named in the case, and 18 months later ran away from him. Then followed a succession of lovers. She became notorious for her profligacy. Her startling beauty and her scandalous conduct held her in the public eye, and it was never very long but that she gave the gossips something to talk about. Her name stank in the nostrils of decent people. She was a gambler, a spendthrift, and a wanton. But though unfaithful to her lovers, she was constant to her friends, and there always remained a few who would never allow, whatever she did, that she was anything but a very nice woman. She had candor, high spirits, and courage. She was never a hypocrite. She was generous and sincere. It was at this period of her life that I came to know her. For great ladies, now that religion is out of fashion, when they are very much blown upon, take a flattering interest in the arts. When they receive the cold shoulder from members of their own class, they condescend sometimes to the society of writers, painters, and musicians. I found her an agreeable companion. She was one of those blessed persons who say quite fearlessly what they think, thus saving much useful time, and she had a ready wit. She was always willing to talk, with a diverting humor, of her lurid past. Her conversation, though uninstructed, was good, because, notwithstanding everything, she was an honest woman. Then she did a very surprising thing. At the age of 40, she married a boy of 21. Her friends said it was the maddest act of all her life, and some who had stuck to her through thick and thin, now, for the boy's sake, because he was nice, and it seemed shameful thus to take advantage of his inexperience, refused to have anything more to do with her. It really was the limit. They prophesied disaster, for Elizabeth Vermont was incapable of sticking to any man for more than 6 months. Nay, they hoped for it, since it seemed the only chance for the wretched youth that his wife should behave so scandalously that he must leave her. They were all wrong. I do not know whether time was responsible for a change of heart in her, or whether Peter Vermont's innocence and simple love touched her, but the fact remains that she made him an admirable wife. They were poor, and she was extravagant, but she became a thrifty housewife. She grew on a sudden so careful of her reputation that the tongue of scandal was silenced. His happiness seemed her only concern. No one could doubt that she loved him devotedly. After being the subject of so much conversation for so long, Elizabeth Vermont ceased to be talked about. It looked as though her story were told. She was a changed woman, and I amused myself with the notion that when she was a very old lady, with many years of perfect respectability behind her, the past, the lurid past, would seem to belong not to her, but to someone long since dead, whom once she had vaguely known. For women have an enviable faculty of forgetting, but who can tell what the fates have in store? In the twinkling of an eye, all was changed. Peter Vermont, after 10 years of an ideal marriage, fell madly in love with a girl called Barbara Canton. She was a nice girl, the youngest daughter of Lord Robert Canton, who was at one time Under Secretary for Foreign Affairs, and she was pretty in a fair and fluffy way. Of course, she was not for a moment to be compared with Lady Elizabeth. Many people knew what had happened, but no one could tell whether Elizabeth Vermont had any inkling of it, and they wondered how she would meet a situation that was so foreign to her experience. It was always she who had discarded her lovers. None had deserted her. For my part, I thought she would make short work of little Miss Canton. I knew her courage and her adroitness. All this was in my mind now, while we chatted over our luncheon. There was nothing in her demeanor, as gay, charming, and frank as usual, to suggest that anything troubled her. She talked as she always talked, lightly but with good sense and a lively perception of the ridiculous of the various topics which the course of conversation brought forward. I enjoyed myself. I came to the conclusion that by some miracle she had no notion of Peter's changed feelings, and I explained this to myself by the supposition that her love for him was so great she could not conceive that his for her might be less. We drank our coffee and smoked a couple of cigarettes, and she asked me the time. 2:45. I must ask for my bill. Won't you let me stand you lunch? Of course, she smiled. Are you in a hurry? I'm meeting Peter at 3. Oh, how is he? He's very well. She gave a little smile, that tardy and delightful smile of hers, but I seemed to discern in it a certain mockery. For an instant she hesitated, and she looked at me with deliberation. You like curious situations, don't you? She said. You'd never guess the errand I'm bound on. I rang up Peter this morning and asked him to meet me at 3. I'm going to ask him to divorce me. You're not, I cried. I felt myself flush and did not know what to say. I thought you got on so well together. Do you think it's likely that I shouldn't know what all the world knows? I'm really not such a fool as all that. She was not a woman to whom it was possible to say what one did not believe, and I could not pretend that I did not know what she meant. I remained silent for a second or two. Why should you allow yourself to be divorced? Robert Canton is a stuffy old thing. I very much doubt if he'd let Barbara marry Peter if I divorced him. And for me, you know, it isn't of the smallest consequence. One divorce, more or less. She shrugged her pretty shoulders. How do you know he wants to marry her? He's head over ears in love with her. Has he told you so? No, he doesn't even know that I know. He's been so wretched, poor darling. He's been trying so hard not to hurt my feelings. Perhaps it's only a momentary infatuation, I hazarded. It may pass. Why should it? Barbara's young and pretty. She's quite nice. They're very well suited to one another. And besides, what good would it do if it did pass? They love each other now, and the present in love is all that matters. I'm 19 years older than Peter. If a man stops loving a woman old enough to be his mother, do you think he'll ever come to love her again? You're a novelist. You must know more about human nature than that. Why should you make this sacrifice? When he asked me to marry him 10 years ago, I promised him that when he wanted his release, he should have it. You see, there was so great a disproportion between our ages, I thought that was only fair. And are you going to keep a promise that he hasn't asked you to keep? She gave a little flutter of those long, thin hands of hers, and now I felt that there was something ominous in the dark glitter of that emerald. Oh, I must, you know. One must behave like a gentleman. To tell you the truth, that's why I'm lunching here today. It was at this table that he proposed to me. We were dining together, you know, and I was sitting just where I am now. The nuisance is that I'm just as much in love with him now as I was then." She paused for a minute, and I could see that she clenched her teeth. "Well, I suppose I ought to go. Peter hates one to keep him waiting." She gave me a sort of little helpless look, and it struck me that she simply could not bring herself to rise from her chair. But she smiled, and with an abrupt gesture sprang to her feet. "Would you like me to come with you?" "As far as the hotel door," she smiled. We walked through the restaurant and the lounge, and when we came to the entrance, a porter swung round the revolving doors. I asked if she would like a taxi. "No, I'd sooner walk. It's such a lovely day." She gave me her hand. "It's been so nice to see you. I shall go abroad tomorrow, but I expect to be in London all the autumn. Do ring me up." She smiled and nodded and turned away. I watched her walk up Davy Street. The air was still bland and spring-like, and above the roofs, little white clouds were sailing leisurely in a blue sky. She held herself very erect, and the poise of her head was gallant. She was a slim and lovely figure, so that people looked at her as they passed. I saw her bow graciously to some acquaintance who raised his hat, and I thought that never in 1,000 years would it occur to him that she had a breaking heart. I repeat, she was a very honest woman.